The winter of 842 AD arrived earlier than expected, heavier than it should have, and stranger than anyone could explain. Snow blanketed the northern coastlines of Scandinavia in unnatural silence, thick and slow, falling like ash from a funeral pyre. No wind howled. No wolves sang. Only the crack of branches under unseen weight disturbed the emptiness. From the village of Havskald, near the edge of the known world, a war band of 29 men and 1 woman departed in search of glory. Their leader, a broad-shouldered chieftain named Ivar Gyllenskar, claimed a vision had come to him, a land beyond the fjords, past the frozen rivers, where something ancient waited. His voice had thundered through the longhouse that night as flames danced against the carved beams. "We raid the south for silver," he said. "But beyond the snow, there are secrets older than gold." None dared challenge him. Ivar's brother had died weeks earlier, found in the woods with his bones twisted inward, mouth agape, and frost burned into his eyes. The seer woman, Vilda, said he had been seen by something that remembers. Ivar had not wept. He had sharpened his axe, gathered his men, and walked into the snow. They moved east, dragging 2 long sledges filled with supplies, axes, and salted meat. The forest welcomed them with nothing but silence. Not a crow. Not a hare. Even the rivers were frozen still, locked in white mirrors. It was Bjorn Skeggesson, the youngest of the group, who first noticed the patterns. "Look," he said, pointing to the treeline on their 3rd day. "The snow, it's falling in circles." At first the others scoffed, but soon they saw it too. The flakes moved not with the breeze but in spirals, twisting above their heads, falling in slow loops as if guided by an unseen hand. Vilda whispered an old curse under her breath. Ivar told them to press on. By the 5th day, they came upon the clearing. It had no name. It had no tracks. It had no scent. The snow there was untouched, yet packed so tightly it shimmered like glass. In the center stood a single totem, 8 feet tall, carved of blackened wood, worn smooth by something far older than weather. No one approached it, not even Ivar. They made camp without fire, their breath fogging in the air like smoke from funeral ships. That night, the whispers began. They were faint, but constant. Not carried by the wind, there was no wind. The sound came from the air itself, like distant voices speaking just out of reach. Some in the camp thought it was dreams. Others knew better. Thrain the one-eyed woke screaming before dawn, clutching his own throat. "She's spoken to me!" he cried. "She was behind my eyes!" He clawed at his face until blood smeared across his beard. Vilda held him down, humming an old Sami lullaby meant to silence spirits. Ivar said nothing. He watched the forest. By the 7th day, their firewood no longer caught flame. The flint sparked, the dry bark hissed, but the fire would not come. It was as if the cold had grown intelligent, selective, unwilling to allow warmth. Thorstein Hammerhand tried to burn one of the strange wooden idols they had found leaning against a rock. The moment the fire licked its edges, he dropped to his knees, vomiting black bile onto the snow. His skin turned white in blotches and his fingernails cracked in half. "I touched its name," he whispered. And it touched back. The whispers grew bolder. Now they came in pairs, one behind the ear, another at the nape of the neck. Warriors began speaking in their sleep, repeating the same phrase over and over. "Not yet! Not yet! Not yet!" No one knew what it meant. On the 10th night, they lost another man. Rolf Hightooth vanished during his watch. They found his tracks circling the camp, again and again, hundreds of loops in the snow. At the center, a hole no wider than a fist, perfectly round and impossibly deep, disappeared into the earth. His spear lay beside it, still warm to the touch. Ivar called a halt the following morning. His face had changed. His confidence remained, but his eyes had dulled, as though he were seeing something far beyond the frost-covered trees. "There is something here," he admitted to Vilda. "And it does not sleep." That night, they set no watch. They knew it would not matter. By the 12th day, they decided to return. Only 14 of them remained. 2 were frostbitten. 3 had stopped speaking altogether. The rest moved in silence, dragging their own dead behind them in makeshift sleds of bone and hide. Whatever glory they had sought in these woods had been left behind, or never existed at all. The return journey was slower. The snow now fell upward. The wind moved without direction. Once they passed their own tracks, looping in patterns that none remembered walking. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the whisper stopped. It was the morning of the 17th day. They emerged from the treeline into a thawing field where spring should not have come. Birds sang. Rabbits darted. The forest behind them looked no different than it ever had. No black idols, no glassy snow, no vanishing voices. They returned to Havskald as fewer, smaller men. No tales were told. No saga was sung. Ivar placed a single object on the table of the longhouse, a shard of carved stone, smooth as water, etched with symbols none could read, symbols that seemed to shimmer when left in shadow. He said nothing about it. He only stared at the fire for 3 days straight, until his eyes burned red and his skin blistered. Vilda buried the shard in the earth near the fjord. That night, the frost came back. The snow whispered again. And the people of Havskald began to forget. Not what had happened, but who it had happened to. In the centuries that followed, scribes and skalds across the north would whisper of a place not found in sagas or scripture, a land that refused ink. It existed not in any chart, yet was remembered in nightmares. They called it by many names: Iskaldheim, the uncarved north, the land without fire. But among those who had seen its edge and lived, it was known simply as the place beyond the map. The Norse were not strangers to darkness. Their world was carved from frost and iron, their gods born from chaos and flame. They had crossed oceans and carved settlements into unforgiving coasts. Yet even the bravest jarls refused to send their fleets past a certain threshold. It wasn't fear of storms or beasts. It was fear of what remembered them. The village of Utervik sat closest to that line, a ragged outpost of trappers and outlaws who fished near frozen waters and whispered of things they saw on clear nights. Strange lights above the trees. Deer with no eyes that didn't bleed when cut. Shadows that moved against the wind. Outsiders dismissed these as drunken tales. But Utervik kept a tradition. Every new moon, they lit fires at the edge of the forest and left bread wrapped in black cloth. No one remembered why. Only that once, long ago, they had forgotten, and 3 children disappeared before dawn, their footprints leading to the treeline and ending in a perfect circle. In 864 AD, an aging monk named Alric of Gotland arrived in Utervik. He carried a crumbling scroll, yellowed by age, said to be copied from the notes of a Byzantine cartographer who had sailed too far north before vanishing. Alric had spent years gathering fragments, ruined stone carvings from forgotten monasteries, scratched warnings on pagan altars, and accounts of Norse hunters who spoke of cold that breathed. He had a theory that beyond the northernmost settlements lay not empty land, but a hidden civilization that had existed before the Aesir were worshipped. A people not erased by time, but concealed by will, who had once shaped the land itself to remain unseen. The scroll he carried bore only a single legible phrase: "They sleep in ice that remembers." Skeptics in Utervik laughed at the monk. He had no weapons, no crew, and no coin. But Alric was not there to fight. He was there to find the threshold, the precise point at which the land shifted. Not just physically, but spiritually. He believed there was a place where the fabric between worlds had thinned, a border, not just of maps, but of meaning. On the 23rd night of his search, he found it. A ridge, north of the Black Pines, overlooked a plain of glacial stone. To the eye, it was unremarkable. But the snow there did not crunch. It hummed. The trees leaned away from it. And though the wind was calm, Alric's breath spiraled upward, vanishing into the sky. He took a single step forward. The next morning, a hunter from Utervik found him kneeling at the ridge, eyes wide open, unmoving, unblinking. He had not frozen. His skin was warm. But his pupils had turned entirely white. In his hand, he clutched a pendant, a circle with 3 intersecting lines carved into jet black stone. A symbol no one recognized, though some claim to have seen it faintly glowing on the bark of certain trees near the frost line. Ulrich never spoke again. He was taken south and placed in a monastery, where he drew the same pattern over and over in ash, blood, or ink, whatever he could find. He died 5 years later, never uttering another word. But before he passed, he carved one final sentence into the stone wall of his cell. They do not slumber. They observe. As Ulrich faded from memory, others began to chase his madness. In 878 AD, a Varangian scout named Rolf Eriksson attempted to chart the untraveled north. He was a pragmatist, not a dreamer, hardened by Byzantine war, unmoved by myth. He took with him 10 seasoned men, each sworn not to flee, no matter what they encountered. His records, kept meticulously in rune journals, detailed a journey that began like any other. Cold winds, sparse food, distant howls. But as they moved beyond the frost line, the entries changed. Day 7. The stars move strangely here. Or perhaps we move and they do not. Day 10. Found a stone ring, not natural. No lichen. Perfect shape. A dozen steps wide. We walked around it. Heard footsteps that didn't match ours. Day 13. Sven saw a figure in the woods. No face. Just outline. Like light bent around it. We followed. The trees moved while we walked. Day 14. Night came without warning. No dusk. Just light, gone. The final entry was scratched violently, as though written in panic. Day 15. They are not men. They do not hunt. They wait. They let us come. They let us leave. Only Rolf returned. He was covered in a thin layer of frost that did not melt. His voice, once loud and commanding, dropped to a whisper. He spoke only in riddles, and when pressed about what he saw, would only say, "The snow there, it listens." His map was never finished. He had burned it in the night before returning. When asked why, he said, "Some things remain unmarked for a reason." Word of these encounters spread across the north, never openly, never sung, but carried in low murmurs between skalds, traders, and madmen. A shape began to form, a civilization not lost, but hiding. A people whose territory was memory, not land. They existed in spaces people passed through without realizing. They were in the fog that stole your voice. In the silence between trees. In the patterns frost left on your skin. Not enemies. Not allies. Not beasts. Just aware. The Norse began to mark new maps differently. Where once they had left blank space, they began to draw wide bands of deep blue, not to show ice or sea, but something else. These bands bore no symbols. The first true contact came not by intention, but by arrogance. In the year 889 AD, Jarl Sigurd Henriksson of Runnarvik declared he would succeed where others had failed. His village, nestled in the icy cliffs of the northeastern coast, had suffered a series of strange calamities. Livestock vanished without tracks, fresh water frozen in midsummer, whispers drifting down from the mountains at dusk. When his youngest son began speaking in riddles he could not have known, Sigurd took it as a sign. He summoned 30 men, each handpicked for strength, loyalty, and fearlessness. They brought with them sledges, axes, torches, and a bound elder from the Sami people, an old man named Alo, who spoke little and stared often. Sigurd called it an expedition of dominance. He would find this so-called hidden civilization, and either burn it or bend it. For 9 days they trekked across frozen hills and windless plains. The air thinned, but no snow fell. The trees grew sparse, and the soil cracked like glass beneath their boots. By the 12th day, even the crows had stopped following. The only sound was their own breath, thick in their beards. Then, on the 14th morning, they found the symbols. Carved deep into slabs of stone, these markings stretched across a natural causeway, an ancient pass between 2 frozen cliffs. Each symbol was unique, and none matched Norse, Latin, or any known tongue. Alo refused to approach them. He muttered a prayer to no god Sigurd recognized and sat in the snow, refusing to rise. Sigurd ordered his men forward. At first, nothing happened. Then came the sound. Not a voice. Not thunder. It was more like memory being played aloud. It echoed across the cliff walls, familiar words spoken by unfamiliar tongues. One man dropped his torch. Another turned pale and vomited. Sigurd shouted for silence, but the echoes only grew louder, layering over each other in overlapping cadence until no one could tell what was being said, only that something was speaking, and everything was listening. That night, the first man died. Eirik Thorvaldsson, a seasoned raider who had survived a dozen campaigns, awoke screaming and tearing at his face. By the time others restrained him, he had gouged both eyes from his skull. Blood froze on his cheeks before it touched the ground. His last words were, "They are not what we thought." Sigurd pushed on, desperate to salvage control. By the 16th day, they reached the mouth of a wide basin, surrounded by jagged ice shelves that shimmered with faint light despite the overcast sky. In the center stood a structure, stone, precise, but eroded by time. It resembled no Viking hall, no Roman ruin. Its geometry was wrong, corners too sharp, angles that bent the eye. It had no doors, only a narrow slit from which steam rose like breath. Alo stood at its edge, trembling. "This is not a place for men," he whispered. "It never was." Sigurd ignored him. He ordered 2 men forward, Grim and Stilla, to enter through the slit. They stepped inside. 5 heartbeats passed. Then 10. Then 30. No sound. No scream. No return. Sigurd called out, then cursed, then followed them in. Only Sigurd came out. He stumbled, wide-eyed and drenched in a thin sheet of frost, though the air was above freezing. His lips moved without sound. When his men reached for him, he collapsed. That night, Sigurd awoke screaming. He did not recognize his own name. He called out for a woman no one knew, in a voice that was not his own. He spoke of the mirror that breathes, and the hands beneath the stone. He tore at his tunic, demanding they strip him, claiming, "They are under the skin." They restrained him with ropes and prayer. By morning, 6 more men were gone. There were no tracks. No blood. No struggle. Just silence. The survivors turned back. They carried Sigurd tied to a sledge, wrapped in furs he no longer felt. He did not speak for the rest of the journey. He stared skyward, blinking only when snow touched his face. Of the 30 that set out, 12 returned. The Sami elder Alo was not among them. His body was never found. When the survivors reached Runnarvik, they were changed. Some fell ill within days, skin peeling, teeth loosening, eyes darkened. Others fled into the woods and were never seen again. The village elders demanded answers. Sigurd did not speak. For 7 days he sat in his longhouse, staring into the fire. On the 8th day, he carved a message into the wooden beam above his hearth, using the blade of his own sword. "They are not spirits. They are not men. They are watchers. And we are trespassers in a place they have not finished building." That night, Sigurd vanished. His armor was found outside the village gate, frozen solid and empty, as though it had never held a body at all. In time, the tale was dismissed as legend. The church called it pagan madness. The skalds refused to sing of it. But among those who trade in whispers and cold truths, the name Sigurd is still spoken with caution. His final words, carved in iron and memory, remain etched in the beam of what was once his hall. "If you hear the voice in the ice, do not answer. It already knows your name." The forest to the north of Galdarvik had always been dense, but not unnatural. Pines grew in thick, orderly lines, and the villagers hunted beneath their canopy for generations. Children were told not to wander too deep, but that was out of fear of wolves, not myth. That changed in the spring of 903 AD. It began with the trees shifting. Not falling. Not being cut. Just, not where they had been the day before. At first, the changes were subtle. A hunting path that once ran straight now curved strangely. Landmarks vanished overnight. A pile of stones, a burnt stump, a stretch of moss familiar to every local disappeared as if wiped clean. Trappers claimed their snares had moved. One man, Helric the Tanner, swore he walked in circles all day despite following his own marked trail. "It's as if the trees are breathing," he muttered over his mug of ale. "In. Out. And I'm walking on their lungs." The villagers laughed. Until he vanished. Helric left one morning with his 2 hounds and did not return. His wife found the dogs the next day, curled together on their backs, eyes wide, frozen solid, yet not a trace of snow had fallen. No blood. No tracks. Just silence. 3 search parties went out. 2 returned. The third came back different. They looked normal at first, cold, tired, shaken, but their eyes had changed. Wide, glassy, slow blinking, as if they'd forgotten how to process sunlight. They could not remember the exact path they had taken. They spoke little, and when pressed, only offered the same phrase. "The trees were watching us." The local elder, Arnkadil, sent word to the nearest settlement of Runholm, requesting a woodsman and a holy man. A week later, both arrived, Eirik Snowhand, a tracker who had survived a bear attack with only one eye, and Father Marlin, a Christian priest who had recently burned a shrine in a neighboring village. Neither man believed in ghost stories. Both would leave with scars they could not explain. Their plan was simple: travel a mile into the forest, find Halric's remains, mark the path with bright red cloth, and return before dusk. By midday, they were already lost. The red cloth they tied to trees vanished behind them, not blown away by wind, not stolen by animals, simply gone. The compass Marlin carried spun wildly. Eirik's carved map, drawn from years of experience, now led them to nothing but endless rows of the same 3 crooked trees repeating every few hundred paces. They began to notice something else. The bark on many trees had fine, unnatural slashes, forming lines and spirals too deliberate to be random. Eirik touched one of the marks and recoiled. "It's warm," he said. "The wood's warm." They heard footsteps that didn't match their own. At first, it sounded like distant echoes. Then the steps came faster, heavier, as if running, but there was no figure to match the sound. They stopped only when both men froze in place. They stood still for nearly an hour, listening. Waiting. The forest responded in kind, silent, but never still. The branches didn't sway, yet the shadows moved. Not fast, not sudden, but gradually, in a way only noticed if one stared too long. Marlin, stubbornly muttering scripture under his breath, said it was illusion. Eirik disagreed. "These aren't shadows," he whispered. "They're not cast by anything. They're watching." They camped that night under a thick canopy, building no fire. Neither slept. Something circled them. Never closer than the edge of vision, never far enough to relax. Once, in the dead of night, Marlin claimed to see a figure crouched in the trees, tall, with limbs too long, face covered in what looked like bark or bone. By morning, Eirik was gone. No struggle. No sound. His bedroll was undisturbed. Only his knife remained stuck upright in the ground, perfectly balanced. Marlin wandered for 3 days. The forest would not let him leave. Paths changed. Rivers reversed direction. At one point he followed the sound of running water, only to find it was leaves rustling, yet there was no wind. He screamed for help, but his own voice seemed to fall flat, absorbed by the trees. On the 4th day, he stumbled into a clearing that was too perfect, a circle of earth in the shape of a spiral, trees evenly spaced, bark peeled into symbols he could not read. In the center lay Helric, arms crossed, eyes open, mouth frozen in a final, soundless scream. Marlin backed away. Behind him, the trees shifted. The path he had entered through was gone. A new one stood open. He followed it. 2 days later, he staggered into Galdarvik. Covered in mud, eyes bloodshot, he dropped to his knees at the edge of the village and said one thing before collapsing. "They let me go." He would never speak again. What happened in that forest was never explained. The villagers sealed off the northern trails. No more hunts. No more gathering. A wooden wall was raised along the edge, blessed by priests and smeared with ash. People moved south. Children were forbidden from learning the old paths. But on certain nights, the cold, still ones, the forest came closer. It wasn't sudden. It wasn't obvious. But the trees at the edge would lean forward just slightly. The mist would rise even without a change in weather. And those foolish enough to peer between the trunks claimed they saw something tall and still standing among the shadows, not hiding, just waiting to be seen. The skalds stopped singing songs about Galdarvik. Mapmakers left it off their scrolls. But old men in distant villages still speak of it around fire pits, when the children are asleep and the wind is dead quiet. They call it the place where the forest walks, and where no man walks twice. In the highland pass beyond Vargfell, where the cliffs rise like jagged teeth against the sky, there lies a narrow valley choked with fog even in midsummer. Few dared venture there, not because of tales or curses, but because nothing grew. No grass. No moss. No birds sang. Even the insects avoided it. Hunters called it Hollow Glen, a name that stuck not out of legend, but because the land felt wrong beneath their feet. It was in this valley, during the harsh winter of 918 AD, that a group of stonecutters from the southern region of Hamar came in search of rare black granite said to be buried in the cliffside. The team was led by Soren Ulfriksson, a man of little fear and great ambition. He brought with him 7 others, stonemasons, haulers, and his son Eirik, a boy of 17 with quick hands and quicker eyes. Their first days in the valley were uneventful. They set up camp along a frozen creek, marked survey points, and began chipping away at the exposed rock face. The stone was darker than expected, a charcoal gray that shimmered faintly under torchlight. Soren called it moonrock, and declared they'd strike wealth before the next thaw. But on the 4th day, their hammers struck something hollow. It wasn't a cave. It wasn't a chamber. Beneath 3 feet of granite, they uncovered a series of layered tiles, black, smooth, etched with shallow symbols that didn't match any Norse, Saxon, or Roman inscription. Beneath those tiles, bones. Not animal bones. Not human either. Long limbs, thin ribs, skulls slightly too narrow, with no clear jawline. Instead of sockets, the eye regions of the skulls were flat, smooth, and unbroken. No teeth. No nose holes. Just blank faces. The men stood in silence. Eirik reached out and brushed snow from one of the skulls. The moment his fingers touched it, he staggered backward. He later described it as a vibration through the bone, like something inside it remembered being touched. Soren, ever the skeptic, ordered the remains unearthed for study. They extracted 4 full skeletons, each one between 6 and 7 feet tall, laid out in deliberate positioning, arms crossed, legs straight, heads pointed north. That night, the wind returned to the valley for the first time since their arrival. But it didn't blow from the cliffs. It came from the ground. The next morning, the entire camp was covered in a fine layer of frost, despite no snowfall. All of their firewood was soaked. The creek had frozen solid in the night. Strange spiral patterns had formed in the ice, radiating outward from where the skeletons had been stored. One of the masons, Rurik, went missing just before breakfast. They found him sitting cross-legged in the woods, staring at one of the skulls he had taken to clean. His breath was slow, and his eyes unfocused. When they shook him, he said only one thing. "They aren't dead. Just quiet." Soren demanded the bones be reburied. He wasn't a superstitious man, but something had shifted. The men moved quickly, returning the remains to their original positions as best they could. But when they tried to seal the site with rocks, the stones cracked, not from pressure, but from cold. The temperature dropped nearly 20 degrees in 2 hours. That night, they saw the figures. They came from the tree line, tall and unmoving. Silhouettes, not quite solid. Their faces glowed faintly, not with light, but with a lack of it, like patches of darkness that refused firelight. They stood still for hours. Never moved. Never blinked. By morning they were gone. Eirik woke to find a small stone disc in his bedroll, flat, smooth, etched with the same symbols they had seen on the tiles. He threw it into the fire. The flames turned blue and hissed for 3 minutes before the disc cracked and vanished into ash. Soren ordered an immediate retreat. As they packed their tools, they found that every chisel and hammer used on the bones site had rusted overnight. Their food supplies had frozen inside sealed crates. And the cliffs echoed, not with sound, but with memory. Eirik later said he heard voices repeating their own conversations, hours after they'd happened, as if the valley was trying to remember them. Only 5 of them made it out. Rurik was found days later by a passing caravan, naked, covered in frostbite, and clutching a skull made of polished stone. He had carved eyes into it. Human eyes. His own eyes were gone. The skull was taken to the monastery at Elverud. Monks refused to keep it. It never gathered dust. Its surface remained cold even when placed near fire. One monk, curious, etched a cross into it. That night, he died in his sleep. His mouth was frozen shut from the inside. The artifact was buried beneath the chapel. The ground above it never thawed again. Back in Hamar, Soren never spoke of the expedition. He forbade his son from writing it down, but the story still spread. Builders began whispering of the stone-faced ones, not gods, not demons, but something in between. Watchers from before the ice. Preserved, not dead. Waiting, not buried. A few years later, another crew attempted to return to Hollow Glen. They found the camp buried beneath a layer of rock and ice. No signs of the excavation remained. The entrance to the burial site had collapsed. But etched into the cliff above it, in deep, deliberate lines, was a symbol. A blank circle with 3 shallow notches beneath it. A face. Without eyes. Without voice. Watching. The winter of 931 AD was known later as the cold that made the dead shiver. Even by northern standards, it was brutal. Lakes froze to their depths, iron snapped in blacksmiths' hands, and whole villages were entombed in snowdrifts tall as longships. Yet one region suffered worse than any other, a coastal village called Brindal, nestled between a frozen fjord and a glacier the locals called the White Silence. No one who lived in Brindal remembered the glacier ever moving. It had stood still for generations, as constant as the sea. Fishermen told tales about it whispering at night, but they were shrugged off as drunken fables. The villagers respected it but didn't fear it. That changed in the final days of November. It began with the groaning. Late one night, a sound rolled across the village, deep, stretched, and miserable, like the earth itself exhaling in pain. It wasn't thunder. It wasn't wind. It came from the glacier. People came outside clutching cloaks and oil lamps. The groan faded, leaving only stillness. But in the morning, the ice had shifted. Not cracked, shifted. Houses nearest the glacier were now closer by several feet, though no one remembered the ground shaking. A scout named Arvid climbed the ridge to see what had moved. He returned before nightfall, pale and shivering, though the weather had warmed slightly that day. He told the elders what he saw, a long fracture down the center of the glacier, wide enough to swallow a cart. The strange part? It wasn't random. The crack curved in a spiral. Worse, the ice near the split looked wrong, not jagged and chaotic, but smooth, as if carved intentionally. Over the next 3 days, the sound returned. Not groaning this time, screaming. It came in pulses. Always at night. Always from the glacier. And it never echoed. Even when it bellowed across the mountains, it didn't bounce or fade. It stopped, like the sound didn't want to be remembered. The villagers tried to stay indoors. Some prayed. Others packed to leave. But when they tried to cross the fjord, the sea ice had cracked in impossible patterns, forming rings and spirals that couldn't be explained by tides or pressure. The bridge of frozen land that normally formed in winter was gone. They were trapped. On the 5th night, the village dogs howled uncontrollably. Then one by one, they went silent, not whimpering, not fading, just silent. By morning, every dog was dead. No wounds. No signs of poisoning. Their eyes were wide open, and their bodies stiffened in shapes that suggested terror. That same day, a group of 5 hunters went to investigate the glacier. Only 2 returned. Their story was difficult to understand. One spoke in broken phrases, the other in full sentences that didn't make sense. But both described the same thing: figures inside the ice. Not beneath it. Not trapped. Inside. Dozens of them. Tall, lean, arms spread wide as if embracing something. Some were blurry, like smudges caught in frozen glass. Others were painfully clear. One hunter said he recognized a face, not a stranger, but someone from the village who had died long ago. A woman who drowned in the fjord 20 years before. But the body in the ice had been different. She was smiling. The hunters tried to dig, but the moment their blades touched the ice, the screaming returned, louder than ever, shaking the snow from rooftops and splitting several trees at the edge of town. One of the hunters dropped to the ground bleeding from his ears. He died before nightfall. The glacier cracked again that evening. Another spiral, larger this time, running deeper into the valley. This one glowed faintly, even in the darkness, as if something warm pulsed beneath the surface. The villagers began to panic. Fires were lit around the perimeter. Sigils were carved into doorframes. A messenger was sent south, but no horse would ride past the spiraled fjord ice. The man went on foot. He was never seen again. That night, the children began to sleepwalk. One by one, they left their beds and walked toward the glacier in silence. Eyes open. Feet bare. No expression on their faces. Parents scrambled to stop them, dragging them back into the houses. Some had to be tied down. Others screamed in strange tones, not in pain, but in protest, as if something had called them, and they didn't want to be denied. Elder Rother, the oldest man in Brindal, finally spoke the words no one else would. "This place is being remembered by something that should have forgotten us." He said that the glacier wasn't just ice, it was a lid. A cover for something not dead, but buried. The next morning, the screaming stopped. But it wasn't silence. It was breathing. The villagers heard it at the same time, low, steady, wet breaths coming from beneath the glacier. Snow shifted. Roofs creaked. The spiral fractures in the ice moved like veins pulsing with invisible blood. The breath grew louder. Some tried to run. Others stayed still, praying. A few simply walked into the fog, hands raised, as if surrendering. Then, without warning, the glacier collapsed, not all at once, but in pieces, like shattered glass falling in slow motion. No explosion. No quake. Just a final exhale. And then the sky went still. A week later, when traders from the southern routes reached Brindal, they found the entire village encased in a thin sheet of ice. Every building. Every body. Perfectly preserved. Eyes open. Skin unblemished. No signs of violence. No fire. No disease. Just silence. Inside the longhouse, a message had been scratched into the frozen hearthstone, carved deep with a steel blade. "They have been beneath us longer than we've been above." The glacier? Gone. In its place, a vast, empty basin, so smooth it reflected the sky. The traders didn't stay long. They left offerings at the edge of the basin, blades, runes, food, and returned south without speaking a word of what they saw. Over time, Brindal was forgotten. Erased from maps. Skipped in stories. But on some nights, when the air is cold and the moon reflects perfectly on still water, the screaming returns, not loud, not sudden, but distant, buried deep beneath the surface. Waiting to be heard again. For centuries, the Norsemen prided themselves on conquest. They measured glory in blood, fire, and the crash of shields. They feared no man, no beast, and no god that could not be challenged in battle. But there was one tale, rarely spoken and never sung, of a war that should have happened, but never did. It wasn't lost to time, nor erased by defeat. It simply never began, and that was what terrified those who knew it. It began in 952 AD, during the rule of Jarl Fenrik the Red of Draftsholm, a fierce and paranoid warlord known for his brutality. Fenrik had spent years uniting the fjord settlements under one banner through force, murder, and fear. He had put dozens of rival clans to the sword and claimed territory as far north as the moss-covered rocks where birds ceased to sing. It was there his scouts reported something odd, strange figures seen at the edges of the world, too tall for men, standing perfectly still on distant ridgelines. These watchers never approached, never attacked, but they were always seen just before fires went out and silence fell. Fenric, always eager to prove dominance, decided this was the next enemy to crush. He declared a campaign into the White North, claiming he would drive out the Pale Watchers and expand his domain beyond the frost. He gathered over 200 warriors, archers, berserkers, shield maidens, and even a few monks dragged along for blessings. They were hardened, well-armed, and bloodthirsty. Their banners bore the broken wolf, Fenric's personal sigil. Songs were composed before the battle began, praising a victory not yet won. But as they advanced, the landscape began to shift. The sky darkened with no sign of clouds. Frost formed on weapons that had been burning hot from the forge just days earlier. Animals refused to travel with them. Oxen lay down in the snow and refused to rise. The men pressed on, shoving fear behind their gritted teeth. By the third day, the soldiers reported whispers from the treelines. Not voices, but syllables spoken inside their minds, half-formed thoughts, suggestions, memories that weren't theirs. Some claimed to see old lovers, dead children, or enemies long buried standing among the trees, not in flesh, but in shape, like shadows peeled from memory in given form. The priests began to panic. They warned Fenric not to proceed, claiming they had stepped into a place where time no longer held shape. Fenric struck one of them down with his axe, claiming fear was a worse enemy than ghosts. That night, the torches would not stay lit. Fires hissed and died within minutes. The wind did not howl, it hummed, a low vibration that crawled into bones and made the warriors grip their weapons tighter. On the sixth night, the enemy appeared. Not in force. Not in fury. In formation. Lining the ridgeline ahead, silhouettes emerged, hundreds of them. Tall, unmoving, faces hidden behind masks or shadows, limbs long and wrong. No weapons drawn. No shields raised. Just watching. Their presence was oppressive, like an unseen weight pressing on the chest, making it hard to breathe. Fenric, undeterred, ordered the archers forward. But no one moved. Even the most loyal refused to knock an arrow. A berserker named Torgi, known for biting out a man's throat during a feast, dropped his axe and wept. Then, one of the watchers stepped forward. It didn't walk. It glided. The snow didn't crunch beneath it. It simply shifted forward closer until it stood 30 paces from Fenric's line. Still no weapon. No threat. No sound. But something passed through the soldiers, an invisible wave that made some drop to their knees. Fenric, enraged, roared and charged. He never reached it. He crossed 20 steps before freezing mid-stride. Not in ice, his body simply stopped, like a puppet's strings cut mid-motion. His scream caught in his throat. The air around him shimmered, and he collapsed. When his men reached him, he was still alive, but unseeing. His eyes were wide and glassy, mouth slack, heart beating, but no recognition in his face. He did not respond to touch, voice, or pain. That was when the watchers turned. Without movement, without sound, the entire ridgeline of figures pivoted as one and vanished into the snow. No retreat, no fleeing. One moment they were there. The next, gone. The war band did not pursue. They gathered Fenric's body and marched back in silence, not from shame, but from confusion. No one had died. No one had fought. And yet every man returned hollow. Fenric was placed in his longhouse, his body warm but lifeless, where he remained for 19 days before dying in his sleep. His skin never wrinkled. His breath never returned. The priest said his soul had been peeled away. A warrior with no war to fight. A conqueror that had faced an enemy beyond comprehension, and been ignored. The survivors of that campaign dispersed. Some became monks. Some disappeared into the forests, unwilling to speak of what they saw. The songs written before the march were never sung. The campaign itself was erased from the records. The banners were burned. But among those who still speak in quiet corners, They say the war that didn't happen was more terrifying than any that ever had. Because the Watchers hadn't defended, hadn't spoken, hadn't struck. They had simply been. And the Norse, a people who carved gods from storms and worshipped thunder, could not make sense of an enemy that refused to be won. No challenge. No clash. Just a mirror, showing them the futility of war in a place where time forgets violence. And so the tale of the war that wasn't fated, not because it lacked blood, but because it lacked victory. And to the old Vikings, nothing was more damning than silence in the face of a battle cry. There is a chapel in the northern cliffs of what was once Ostfjell, now buried under ice and forgotten paths. It is not marked on any map, not because it was lost, but because the men who knew of it agreed, wordlessly, that it should be erased. Its stone walls were carved not by Christian hands, nor entirely pagan ones, but something in between. And hanging in the bell tower, untouched by wind or snow, was a bell that had no name, no inscription, and no known maker. It was first discovered in the autumn of 967 AD by a group of Christian monks sent from the south to establish a remote sanctuary away from the distractions of the mainland. The order was strict, contemplative, and isolationist. The idea of a monastery in the snow, where the word of God could echo uninterrupted through mountains and mist, was appealing. The journey was long, but they found the stone structure already standing. Its architecture was foreign. Pillars too narrow, arches that reached in odd angles, windows placed too high for any reasonable design. Yet it had the outline of a church, and more importantly, it had shelter. The monks believed it was a sign. God, they said, had led them to a holy place. The bell was mounted above the entrance, large, black, and silent. No rope attached. No known mechanism to ring it. One monk, Brother Hakon, climbed the tower and tried to strike it with a hammer. The metal didn't chime. It didn't vibrate. It simply absorbed the blow, the sound, and even the echo. He said it was like hitting stone wrapped in wool. Still, they stayed. They cleaned the building, placed a crude altar in the center, and began their quiet worship. For a few weeks, nothing happened. The monks lived in silence, read from scripture, and carried water from a spring near the cliff base. But soon they began to have dreams. Not all at once, but in a slow wave. Dreams of the bell ringing, not with a note, but with a feeling. A deep, cold pulse in the chest, like the memory of a sound that had never been heard. The dreams were always the same. They stood at the chapel's base, looking up as the bell swayed, though there was no wind, and from it poured a soundless roar that cracked the sky and bent the mountains. Some of the monks embraced the visions, believing they were receiving divine messages. Others grew restless. They began to see the bell differently, not as an object of faith, but a warning. One night, Brother Tormund attempted to remove the bell from its mount. He scaled the tower in the dark, carrying a crowbar and a torch. The others watched from below. He reached the top. He placed the tool against the base of the bell, and the wind stopped. Not slowed. Stopped. The flame of his torch froze in place. His robe ceased its fluttering. And then came the sound, not from the bell, but from him. A sharp, sudden scream that cut through the air like metal tearing. He dropped from the tower, landing with a dull thud. His body wasn't broken, but his face had aged decades. His beard was white, his skin withered, his eyes sunken. He was 32 when he climbed. He looked 90 when he fell. He died without speaking. From that night onward the bell rang. Not every night. Not during storms. It rang only in complete stillness, when the snow settled undisturbed, and the sky was clear. The monks never saw it move, never saw the clapper swing. But they heard it, low, pulsing, not a chime but a pressure. Windows cracked inward. Books warped on the shelves. One brother wept for an hour and could not remember why. They tried to leave. The trail back down the cliff was gone. Not buried. Gone. Paths they had walked every day were now blanketed in smooth, untouched ice. The spring they drew water from froze solid. Their food stores spoiled overnight. The bell rang again. This time, they all collapsed. Not unconscious. Not dead. Just collapsed. As if their bodies gave up under the weight of something unseen. When they awoke, their ears bled. One monk, Brother Elias, wandered into the snow that night. He left his boots behind, walking barefoot into the trees. They found him days later, standing in the middle of a clearing, perfectly still, eyes closed, humming a low note none of them recognized. He never responded to touch or voice again. Brother Hakon, once the most devoted of them, began writing feverishly in the margins of their only Bible. He scribbled symbols no one else could read, shapes that looked like eyes, spirals, and a jagged crown. He claimed the bell wasn't forged but grown. That it had roots, like a tree, reaching down into the earth. He said the chapel hadn't been built over something. It was the something. A bloom on a much older, deeper body. Then, on the 33rd night, the bell rang louder than before. The stones in the chapel cracked. The altar split in half. The crucifix on the wall melted, not burned, not broken, but sagged like wax in heat. The walls moaned, and the air turned heavy with salt. The monks fled into the snow, blind with fear. Only 3 survived the descent. One was mute. One had lost his eyes to frostbite. And the last, Brother Hakon, simply laughed until his throat gave out. He died 2 weeks later, and with his last breath whispered, "It was never meant to be heard by ears." The chapel was abandoned. Snow covered it within days. Trees grew around it, fast and crooked. Locals said no birds flew near that ridge. No echoes returned from those cliffs. The survivors never spoke of it again. But one of them, the blind monk, spent the rest of his life carving a small replica of the bell with his fingers, never seeing it, never asking for help. When he died, the bell was buried with him, but on the night of his funeral, a single chime rang across the fjord. No one was near the chapel. No wind blew. But still, it rang. And somewhere deep beneath the earth, something listened. In the remote northern settlement of Gretaby, nestled between jagged black mountains and a windless bay, life had always been hard but steady. The village survived on fishing, ice trapping, and trading seal pelts to merchants passing through the winter routes. Children were rare and treasured, born into silence and raised in harshness. Yet one winter, a generation of children came into the world who were unlike any before. They were healthy, strong, alert, wide-eyed, but they did not speak. Not at birth. Not as toddlers. Not even as they reached the age where words should have been shaping like frost on glass. At first, the villagers thought it a strange coincidence. A fluke. Maybe the cold had delayed their tongues. But the silence stretched on like the endless snow. These children made no sounds, no cries, no babbles, not even laughter. They moved as normal, played among themselves, followed commands. But never uttered a single syllable. They were not mute in the medical sense. They simply chose not to speak. They showed no discomfort. Their faces were expressive, their eyes intelligent, but not one voice passed their lips. By the time they reached age 5, there were 15 of them. The villagers began to worry. Prayers were said. The elder healer consulted scrolls and sagas for signs of curses or old omens. One night, a storm came in from the bay, a blizzard so fierce it buried boats, under snow taller than a man. That same night, the silent children disappeared. No struggle. No footprints. Doors had not been opened. It was as if they had risen from their beds and walked into the wind without stirring a flake. Panic spread. Families screamed. Searches were launched into the whiteout. For 3 days, every adult in Gretaby combed the wilderness, frozen caves, iced over trails, even the cliffs above the water. No sign. No tracks. Nothing. Then, on the 4th morning, they returned. All 15 children. Standing in the village square, barefoot, unshivering, coated in frost but completely unharmed. Their eyes were wider than before. Not afraid, just opened, like windows seeing something vast and incomprehensible. In their hands, they each carried a stone. Identical. Round, black, smooth. No markings. When the villagers tried to question them, they did not respond. They simply looked at the adults with a calm stillness that made many uneasy. The healer attempted to take one of the stones. The child resisted, not with force, but with such absolute stillness that the old woman backed away without a word. That night, the villagers held council. Some wanted to exile the children, fearing possession or curses. Others insisted they were still their sons and daughters. But by sunrise, the matter was decided for them. Because the stones began to hum. Low at first, barely perceptible. A soft vibration through wooden floors and stone walls. Animals fled the village, dogs howling, goats breaking free from pens, birds vanishing into the fog. The humming continued every night at the same time. When the moon reached its peak, the stones would glow faintly, and the children would gather in the square, forming a perfect circle without instruction. They would stand eyes closed, stones held before them, and simply listen. No one knew what to do. The priest tried blessing the village with holy water. It froze mid-air before touching the children. A warrior named Lodin, drunk with fear and anger, charged one of the boys with an axe. He never reached him. His feet froze to the ground. His mouth opened, but no scream came. He collapsed in place, eyes spreading from his chest like veins carved in frost. He died with his eyes still open, staring at the child who never moved. The people stopped intervening. The children continued their nightly rituals for 7 more days. On the 8th night, the sky changed. A ripple passed through the stars, not a cloud, not an aurora, but a wave, as though space itself was reacting to something below. Then the sea began to glow. Not brightly, not violently, but in slow pulses that matched the hum of the stones. The tide moved without wind. Waves reached the edge of the village and stopped as if waiting for something. The children moved to the shore. They stood in a line, stones clutched to their chests, faces turned toward the black water. The humming grew louder, still not painful, but enveloping, like sound felt through bone instead of ears. Then the sea parted. Not in a dramatic, biblical rush, but with the elegance of something old remembering a pattern. Water folded back, revealing a long path of wet stone leading into the ocean's depths. The children began walking. Parents screamed. Some ran after them. None could pass the line of stone. Invisible, untouchable, the path remained sealed. The children walked, single file, until they vanished into the mist, stones still glowing in their hands. The water closed behind them. The glow faded. The sea went still. None ever returned. In the years that followed, Gretaby changed. The fish stopped biting. The snow never fully melted, even in summer. Visitors stopped coming. The bay grew darker. One by one, the villagers left, until only the oldest remained, sitting by windows, waiting for a sound they could no longer describe. The square where the children once stood was buried in salt-blown snow. No grass ever grew there again. But sometimes, when the moon is full and the sea is silent, the stones return. Just for a moment. One will be found on a doorstep, or on a windowsill, still warm, still humming. Always round. Always black. Always silent. And though no children remain in Gretaby, those who remember speak of the way they moved, not like humans, not like spirits, but like messengers of something deeper than ice and older than language. Something that had waited, patient and buried, for voices that did not need words. The children never spoke. Because something else had already spoken through them. Far out on the western cliffs of Nordra's edge, where the sea crashes like thunder against jagged stone and gulls refuse to nest, there once stood a lighthouse with no flame. It rose high above the surf, a pale tower of salt-stained brick and bone-white mortar, narrow at the base but widening slightly as it climbed, like a tree that had grown the wrong way up. The villagers of nearby Retskuld did not build it. No one remembered who did. It was already ancient when their great-grandfathers were boys. No doors led inside. No windows faced the ocean. And yet, it was called a lighthouse. Its shape disturbed the eye. From the shore, it looked almost normal. But the closer one came, the more wrong it became. Lines refused to meet. Edges flickered in sunlight. And most unsettling of all, its single window, A black slit near the top of the tower did not face the sea like every other lighthouse in the world. It faced inland, toward the forests, toward the mountains, toward the people. At first, the lighthouse was ignored. It stood alone on its cliffs, untended and used unlit. Sailors gave it no mind. Then strange things began to happen, small at first, but consistent. Boats anchored near the cliffs would drift at night, even without current. Their compasses spun. The air would grow heavy, as though something immense was breathing beneath the waves. Several times, fishermen were found sleeping on their decks with their eyes open, staring at the window of the lighthouse, lips slightly parted, frost in their beards. Children began to dream of the tower. They described standing in front of it, staring up at the black window while something on the other side stared back. Some said they were pulled toward it, not physically, but in thought, as if their minds were climbing unseen stairs, circling upward toward whatever waited at the top. No one could explain why. Priests came. Rituals were performed. But the dreams spread. Not just to children now, but to anyone who looked at the tower too long. One winter, a scholar named Ulrich traveled from the capital to study the structure. He believed it to be a remnant of pre-ice civilizations, a monument or observatory repurposed by local fear. He set up camp near the cliffside, determined to understand the geometry and material of the lighthouse. After 5 days of silence, the villagers found his tent torn open, supplies untouched, and his journals burned in his own campfire. There were no footprints. No blood. But the cliffs above his tent had fresh drag marks, 2 long grooves, as if something heavy had been pulled upward toward the tower. The villagers searched the base. Still no door. No entry. Only smooth, unbroken stone. One man pressed his ear to the base and claimed he heard footsteps, slow, steady, circling upward, deeper and deeper within. The lighthouse never lit. But it cast shadows. Not just on the cliffs, but across minds. People who spent too long near it grew different. Not mad exactly, but distracted, unanchored. Their memories began to blur. A fisherman named Joran forgot his own daughter's face. A midwife began to speak in languages no one recognized, waking in the middle of the night screaming about an eye that never blinked. The town blacksmith walked into the sea one morning and never came back. His boots were found pointing inland. Finally, the villagers tried to destroy it. A group of 13 men brought pickaxes, hammers, and fire. They hiked to the base and struck the stone. Sparks flew, but no damage was done. The tools bent. The fire would not stay lit. One man tried climbing the outside. He made it 20 feet before letting go and falling with a scream. He did not hit the ground. He simply vanished. No splash. No body. Just gone. The next morning, the lighthouse window changed. It had grown wider. Not broken. Just wider. No one approached it again. Over the next few years, the ground near the tower changed. Grass stopped growing. Birds stopped flying over it. At night, a faint pulse could be seen in the stone, like breath, slow and deep. People avoided the western cliffs. Redskell began to shrink. Families moved away. The dreams didn't stop, but they came less often. Then, on the coldest night of the decade, the lighthouse lit. Not with fire. Not with flame. But with something darker. A light that wasn't light, a void that glowed in reverse. The window blazed like a black sun, casting long, impossible shadows that twisted in place. The village saw it. Everyone did. And for those few seconds, everything stopped. The sea stopped moving. The wind fell silent. Even the stars dimmed. Then, the window closed. The next morning, 37 villagers were gone. No doors had opened. No footsteps led away. Beds were undisturbed. It was as if they had been plucked from time, not space. Their names were never spoken again. It became a rule, never speak the names of the taken. Never look toward the cliff at night. And never, ever speak of the lighthouse aloud. Now, the structure remains. The cliff has eroded. The sea eats the edge more each year. But the tower does not fall. It stands firm, watching, not the ocean, not the sky, but the land, as if waiting for something to emerge. And when storms come in, and the thunder rolls loud enough to drown out thought, there are those who say they can hear a bell from inside the tower, not ringing, but turning. A sound of something being wound up, slowly, endlessly, for a toll that has yet to come. It is a lighthouse. But it does not warn of things approaching. It watches for things already here. In the village of Haldvik, nestled in a cold basin between three dark hills, the sky was a constant companion. The people lived with their necks tilted upward, reading the clouds as others read the sea. They believed the sky was a vast parchment written by the gods, each storm a sentence, each star a whisper. But one winter, in the year 975 AD, the sky stopped speaking. Not because it was empty, but because it had been torn. It began with the crows. For weeks, they circled Haldvik in greater numbers than anyone had seen. Black spirals over the rooftops, louder with each passing day, as if warning something below. Then, suddenly, they vanished. All of them. Gone overnight. The sky was empty, still, pale, and mute. That silence didn't last. On the third night after the crows fled, a soundless thunder rolled across the village. Not heard but felt. It passed through roofs and skin, a pressure wave without a cause. Children woke crying. Milk curdled in cellars. Metal bent slightly, just enough to look wrong. Then came the hole. The next morning, the sky above Haldvik had changed. A perfect circle had opened directly overhead. It wasn't black. It wasn't bright. It wasn't even particularly large, no wider than the village itself. But it was wrong. The clouds around it refused to move. Birds avoided it in wide arcs. Snow didn't fall through it. Instead, above that circle, the sky simply stopped. Not a star. Not a color. Not even darkness. Just absence. As if someone had reached down and scraped a coin-sized patch of reality away. The villagers gathered in the square, eyes upward, mouths dry. They waited for something to emerge. Nothing did. For the first day, they simply watched. On the second, they began to change. Not physically. Not at first. But mentally. Conversations turned strange. People forgot words mid-sentence. Arguments flared over nothing. Children drew spirals in the dirt without knowing why. The blacksmith hammered his own hand flat and never screamed. The priest stood beneath the hole for hours, whispering things no one understood. He died with a smile. His body turned cold in minutes. No one touched it. On the fourth night, snow began falling in a perfect ring around the village, but never in it. The temperature dropped, but fires wouldn't stay lit. Tools rusted indoors. Wells froze from the bottom up. A traveler named Freda arrived that morning, unaware of the hole. The moment she stepped beneath it, she stopped walking. Her eyes rolled back. She dropped her bag and began speaking in an ancient tongue that no one in Haldvik knew, but one old man claimed he had read once in a cave outside Vardelin, carved into bone. She collapsed after an hour. Her heart had stopped, but her mouth continued to move for several minutes after death. The hole remained. No clouds passed it. No wind touched it. It didn't shimmer or pulse. But it watched, and everyone knew it. Not with eyes, but with presence. Animals refused to stay in the village. The few who remained, cats, a single goat, 2 birds, began acting erratically. They stood still for hours. They turned to face the hole and trembled. One bird plucked out its own feathers until it died. The village elders begged the gods for guidance. They burned offerings, built altars, held vigils. Nothing changed. On the 7th day, a boy named Esko climbed the hill behind the village and stared directly up at the hole for 3 straight hours. When he came down, his eyes were completely white, pupils gone. He whispered 3 words. "It sees backwards." He repeated that phrase until his voice failed. That night, he vanished from his bed without a sound. His window was still locked from the inside. Then came the light. Not from above, from below. A soft glow rose from the soil itself, faint as moonlight, casting no shadows, emitting no heat. It pulsed once every 10 seconds. Slowly. Methodically. Matching the villagers' heartbeats until they could feel it in their teeth. Trees near the village grew thin and tall, bark cracking outward as if something inside was pushing to get out. Moss turned black. The meat in cellars began to twist. Not rot. Twist, fibers bending like worms caught mid-turn. The villagers tried to leave. They packed sleds, hitched oxen, lit torches. The snow ring would not let them pass. Not a wall, not a trap, just resistance. As if space itself pushed back gently, like hands on a chest. A man named Olav tried to run through it. He vanished mid-step. No scream. No trace. Just gone. Eventually, they stopped trying. By the 14th day, no one in the village spoke aloud. Not out of fear, but because speech had begun to echo wrong. Words came back twisted, mismatched, or in voices not their own. Some mouths didn't match the sounds they made. Others heard their own names whispered just after speaking. And the skyhole watched. No one saw it open wider. But it felt wider. More present. More aware. Some said they dreamed of falling upward, not into stars, but into layers of thin white hands that reached without moving. Others saw their own homes from above, not from a bird's view, but a still view, like someone had placed their lives on a table and stood quietly watching. Then, without warning, it closed. One morning, the villagers awoke to birds singing. Clouds moving. The snow ring gone. The sky normal again. The hole had vanished. But the village was not the same. Food spoiled instantly. No fires could be lit indoors. Babies were born blind. And the wind in the hills now whispered names, sometimes the names of those long dead, sometimes the names of the living. Always the names of people in the village. Haldvik still stands, but no one stays long. Travelers say the air tastes like copper and that mirrors their fog from the inside. Those who sleep in the village dream of the sky falling open again. A tear in the world, wide and patient. And some say that when the clouds pass just right, you can still see the faintest outline of a perfect circle above the rooftops. Waiting. Near the edge of the Nordwald forest, where the frost clings to trees year-round and sunlight never fully pierces the canopy, lies a cave that no animal will approach and no man enters twice. It was first discovered by accident, or so the story goes, when a hunting party from Karsfeld tracked a wounded elk into the woods and followed its blood trail deep into the pines. The prince led them to a rock face that seemed to breathe. Mist poured steadily from its base, not smoke or fog, but a fine white mist that spread across the forest floor like fingers searching for warmth. Behind it, an opening, a mouth in the earth, tall, narrow, and jagged like torn flesh. One of the men, a scout named Sivan, stepped inside. He told the others he'd be back in moments. He carried a torch and his father's blade. He was never seen again. The others waited for hours. They called, threw stones, lit fires, but the mist only thickened the longer they lingered. Eventually they left, telling the village they'd lost him in the storm. But they didn't speak of the cave. Not then. Not until it breathed. 3 nights later, the same mist rolled into Karsfeld, through the trees, over fences, into homes. It was cold, but not in the way snow was cold. It didn't sting or bite. It emptied. Fires died down. Breath stopped fogging in the air. People woke with a heaviness in their lungs, a sensation as if they'd been breathing something wrong in their sleep. And with the mist came the sounds, low and distant, like voices calling from under deep water. Not cries. Not screams. Just talking. Calm, rhythmic, ceaseless. No one could make out the words. The villagers burned incense. They prayed to the old gods. They hung bells above doorways and slept with steel beneath their pillows. But the cold kept spreading. The livestock refused to enter barns. Roots blackened. Water thickened to slush even when heated. A week later, a child vanished. Her name was Iska. 5 years old, silent sleeper, always afraid of the dark. Her window was open, even though it had been nailed shut. Snow had not blown in. But her footprints led out, barefoot, small, and direct, straight into the trees. No one followed. No one could. By now, they spoke of the cave. An elder named Brinna, old enough to remember the first mention of the place in her grandmother's tales, said the cave was not a wound in the land, but a lung. A hollowed-out place for something that didn't need to move to breathe. She said the mist wasn't just cold, it was memory. And once it entered your home, your mind began to forget what warmth had ever felt like. She wasn't speaking metaphorically. People began forgetting. Small things at first, names, recipes, days of the week. Then bigger things. Entire events vanished from minds. Weddings, births, faces. A woman named Elsha forgot she had a son. He stood right in front of her, crying, and she blinked at him like he was a stranger. Soon, families couldn't remember how many people lived in their houses. Doors were locked from the inside, but no one remembered doing it. People sat around empty tables, unsure if they'd eaten. The mist stayed low, always clinging to the ground like spilled milk, pulsing gently as if in sync with something deep beneath the earth. The cave never moved, never shifted. But they knew it was breathing. Then came the return. 2 months after the initial discovery, Sivan, the scout who had first entered, came back. He walked into the village barefoot, eyes closed, mouth slightly open. His skin was pale, blue at the fingertips, but unblemished. He wore no coat. No weapon. Just the same clothes he'd vanished in, now frozen stiff to his body. He didn't speak. He didn't blink. But he moved with purpose, stepping calmly down the road as people screamed and scattered. His feet left no prints in the snow. His breath didn't fog. When he reached the square, he opened his eyes. They were white. Not glazed, not blind, just white. Like salt bleached in sunlight. Then he opened his mouth and exhaled. The mist poured from him. It billowed outward like smoke from a furnace, wrapping around buildings, sinking into cracks, pouring beneath doors. People slammed shutters. Locked rooms. Prayed. But they could still feel it seeping in, slow and inevitable, like the end of a long-held breath. And then Sivan collapsed. His body cracked when it hit the ground. Not from weight or injury, but like thin ice shattering over deep water. When they dared approach, there was nothing inside his clothes. Just frost. A fine dusting of it, forming the shape of a man and then dissolving. The mist retreated. But the cave still breathed. The villagers held a vote. They would leave. All of them. The land was no longer theirs. Something beneath the ground had remembered it first. But even as they packed, the cave exhaled again, stronger than before. A wind without air. A sound without volume. It whispered across the land, into the bones of the trees and the hearts of men. And from that breath, the forest grew. Overnight, trees doubled in height. Moss blanketed the snow. The village paths disappeared under root and vine. By morning, Carsville was gone. Just outlines in the frost. Foundations filled with mist. Chimneys pointing toward a sky that no longer held warmth. Now, the cave is not marked on any map. No road leads to it. But sometimes, in winter, people hear the breath. And sometimes, when the mist creeps too far south, travelers forget why they left home at all. The Kjelda River ran like a silver thread through the heart of the northern tundra, twisting between cliffs, forests, and forgotten ruins. For centuries, it had been a lifeline, providing water to villages that clung like frost to its banks, feeding trade and legends in equal measure. In summer, it roared with meltwater from distant peaks. In spring, it ran wild and muddy. In autumn, it shimmered under falling leaves. But in winter, it always froze, solid and silent, a highway of ice stretching into the mountains. That was the rhythm. That was the truth. Until one winter it didn't. It began subtly, the kind of change only hunters and ferrymen noticed at first. When the first hard frost of November set in and the ponds cracked with ice, the Kjelda remained fluid. Steam rose from its surface in the early mornings, despite temperatures that would snap bone. At first, they blamed the current. "Too fast to freeze," said old Thane, who lived on the river his whole life. But as December deepened and the lakes nearby vanished beneath a thick white crust, the Kjelda kept flowing, black, smooth, and unbothered. No ice formed along its edges. No frost touched the rocks near its mouth. Trees around the river remained strangely green, as if its presence pushed the seasons back. Then came the sounds. Fishermen began hearing them first, soft, rhythmic thuds beneath the surface, like distant drums muffled by water. Others claimed they heard whispers. Not words. Just the shape of speech. They said if you stood on the bank at night and listened closely, you could hear breathless voices rising with the current. One boy claimed the river called his name. He tried to wade into it and nearly drowned, not because he slipped, but because he walked forward with his arms raised like he was greeting an old friend. When pulled out, he had no memory of going in. He only said, "It knew me." The river's warmth began spreading. Snow near its banks melted in concentric rings. Insects that should have died weeks earlier buzzed in the grass. Fogs rose from it at dawn and dusk, thick and low, curling like tendrils into the forest. Entire sections of land near the water grew damp and soft, even as the surrounding tundra hardened to stone. The people in the village of Ormsvik, built along a bend in the river, didn't speak of it aloud, but they all felt it, that something beneath the water was no longer asleep. One morning, they found the river glowing. Not brightly. Just a faint, pulsing light under the surface, blue at first, then green, then deep violet. It came from beneath the center of the current, deep where no net could reach. The glow didn't reflect. It didn't shimmer on the trees. It simply existed, untouched by the world above. That same night, all the dogs in Ormsvik howled until their throats bled. One by one, they collapsed in the snow, eyes wide and unblinking, still facing the river. Elders gathered in the longhouse and told old stories of how the river had once been a boundary, not just between tribes, but between worlds. Of how, in the time before gods, the Kjelda had been a vein of something deeper, a passage through which the first cold flowed. They spoke of a thing buried at its source, too large to move, too deep to dig, too ancient to name. It hadn't been sealed by stone or spell, but by forgetting. And now, something had remembered. The glow intensified. Birds stopped nesting near the banks. Fish caught from the Kjelda no longer bled red. Their insides were pale, almost translucent, and they dissolved within hours. Children began sleepwalking, always toward the river. Some walked straight into it, faces calm and peaceful. Those pulled back fought like animals to return. One man drowned trying to save his son, his body surfaced downstream with his eyes frozen open, not with ice, but with understanding. That was the word the healer used, trembling as she examined him. He saw something. And it broke him. Then came the thaw. In late January, when the snows should have been thickest, the entire valley began to warm. Not slowly. Overnight. Frost retreated like it had been chased. Riverside trees bloomed with buds out of season. The ground grew soft. And the river swelled, not from rain or melt, but from somewhere below, rising with a slow, steady pulse like something exhaling. The fog became constant, thick as wool, hiding the water's surface entirely. Villagers tied ropes to their children. Some boarded up windows. Others left, walking until their legs failed, refusing to stop until the river was gone from view. The few who remained said the water began to speak. Not in voice. Not in language. But in thought. They described memories that weren't theirs, of standing in places that didn't exist, of holding tools that didn't belong to men, of knowing the shape of things not meant to be known. A woman named Brida walked into the water one morning and knelt until it covered her head. When pulled back out, she whispered a single phrase again and again. It was never meant to freeze. Only to forget. By February's end, the river had begun flowing uphill in places. Gravity ignored it. Trees leaned away. And then, without warning, the glowing stopped. The river turned black. Not natural black, not the darkness of deep water, but the absence of reflection. It didn't ripple. It didn't shine. It simply moved, a void threading through the land. And with its darkening came silence. The birds didn't return. The wind didn't blow. Even footsteps near the banks made no sound. Ormsvik emptied within days. Those who tried to stay vanished one by one. Their homes were found open, fires cold, food untouched. Now the Gjelda remains. Flowing, unfreezing, unchanging. Travelers speak of it in hushed tones. Of the black water that reflects nothing. Of the occasional glimmer beneath its surface, like distant stars swimming in the deep. Some claim it no longer flows at all, but waits, holding something old and patient, something that once slept beneath ice but now dreams with its eyes open. And the land remembers. Not with words, but with the silence that follows forgetting.